Egypt, it's important to understand that this society was one that lasted 3,000 years. But in doing so, it was popular for one reason, because it was able to integrate their love of science, astronomy. You know, the pyramids were perfectly aligned north and south within a fraction of a degree through their own crude ways of studying the stars. They were able to use millions of tons of blocks, each block weighing anywhere from 5 to 12 tons, and maneuver them into place to form perfect pyramids. They organized construction crews that needed food and the whole logistics, so they were able to organize with their construction, their architecture, their science, their engineering, their logistics, a whole society centered around their spirituality. They were so spiritually connected that they organized the whole society around it. That's important to understand as we move forward. So let's get into religion empires of northern and western Africa. So we're going to look at Moors and Al-Andalus, ancient Ghana, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, and Timbuktu. Very briefly, inshallah. So what do you see on this map? Yes, and you see the spread of Islam in North Africa, right? 100 years, within 100 years, after the passing of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, Islam spread both north and west. And when it spread westward, it went past the Nile Valley, past ancient Egypt, into northern Africa, up to northern Africa by virtue of the Berbers. It's very important because the Berbers are going to be instrumental in the spread of Islam both north and south, right? Into the Iberian Peninsula. And what was the Iberian Peninsula known for? This picture right here shows you what? This was the ancient trading routes of the Berbers for about 1,000 years, before the Roman Empire and through the Roman Empire. What do you see that's common between those two maps? Yes, trade routes. So one is the spread of Islam, and one are the established trade routes. So they coincide. So they spread Islam through their system of trading, through their economy, through their economic system. So let's talk about Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus describes the territories controlled by Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula for 8 centuries, starting with 711 all the way to 1492. What's important about 1492? Yes. Explain. Give me some more. I'm in class. We're in class. Yes. Well, King Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula, and at the same time, that same year, they commissioned Columbus to do what? Why? But why? Trade routes. Yes, because the trade routes had normally been through what? The Berbers, through the Muslims. They had normally relationships in the trade routes all the way, they're called the Silk Roads, from China through India, through Northern Africa, up into Europe, as well as in through Turkey and into Europe. So they had established trade routes. The Arabs and the Berbers had controlled the trade route, both Muslims, right? So when they expelled the Muslims out of Spain in 1492, they needed to reconnect with those spices and silks that they were grown accustomed to, and so they needed a new way. And Christopher Columbus was able to sell his way into the situation. He never found India, but he was successful in finding something else, right? So Al-Andalus is important because it stands also for 8 centuries as a model society for Muslim achievement and accomplishment and excellence. And inshallah, we'll spend a few minutes on that. So they created an infrastructure of public libraries, public and private libraries, masters, hospitals, research institutions. They had a culture of learning that promoted the exchange of ideas and scientific achievement and development. They had a multicultural situation of Muslims, Christians, and Jews with ethnic diversity. However, there were some ethnic tensions and hierarchies. Inshallah, we don't have time to deal with it right now, but if we, in the question and answer period, we can go into it. But it's important to understand that even though we're close to a model situation, there's always ethnic tensions that arise even in the best of situations. Education was universal in Al-Andalus. Why? Following the model of the Prophet, right? The Prophet, he established universal education. He promoted education, right? The first revelation was about reading, right? He said, even if you have to go to China to seek knowledge, find it. And the blood of, the ink of the scholar is more valuable than the blood of the martyr. So the Prophet established a culture, a learning culture. And that expanded and it was brought to life in civilizations like Al-Andalus. When Europe was in its dark ages, what was the period of the dark ages?
600 to 1300.
Yes, actually about 600 to 1300, actually probably a little about 400 or 500 AD to about 13 or 1400. Leonardo da Vinci known as around 1400, so about 700-800 years. Why? What happened? People devalued learning. They had 2 universities in all of Europe, 17 in Al-Andalus. 17 universities, 2 in the rest of Europe. So Al-Andalus became a light for Europe of scholarship. Europeans came down and interacted with Muslims and learned through that university system. We don't have time to go into the great achievements of Al-Andalus, but we had the astrolabe, we had excelling in the natural sciences, the father of medicine, the father of mathematics, excelled. People took learning and scientific achievement seriously, and as a result, they were a model society in that regard. The phenomenal architecture, when I was in architecture school, as you know, I majored in architecture. One of the things they made us study was a mosque of Cordoba, one of the great architectural achievements in Al-Andalus, and all the beautiful palaces from the Alcazar Palace in Seville, Al-Jafariya Palace in Aragon, the Palace of Zahara in Cordoba, and obviously the great masjid that's 3, 4, 5, and 6, those numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6, the great masjid of Cordoba. So, inshallah, in the brief time we have left for this first half of our presentation, let's talk about the Berbers and how they were instrumental in spreading Islam both not only northward into the Iberian Peninsula, but southward into Western Africa. So, once again, look at those dots. They represent the trade routes, right? And during the same era, almost the same time scale, between the 700s all the way up to the 1600s, you have this progression of Islamic civilization in Western Africa in 3 great empires: ancient Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Note, each of these kingdoms amassed great wealth primarily from the trade of gold and salt through the trading partners of the Berbers and their trading network. They also overlapped in territory, and each successive kingdom arose from its predecessor. So you have these 3 overlapping kingdoms in time, but also in space. So you have Ghana, that then evolved into Mali, that evolved into the Songhai Empire. So Ghana grew rich and powerful, and its rulers grew rich on the strength of the trans-Saharan trade. And their 2 big products were salt and gold. Why salt? Why was salt such a great value? Yes, exactly. Salt was worth its weight in gold. Why? Because if you're traveling long distance without a refrigerator, You have to preserve your food. And they used salt as a preservative for their food. It was universal in the medieval times. And so as a result, it was very valuable. So salt and gold were two valuable commodities that these early African empires built their wealth on. Interesting enough, this empire lasted about 400 to 500 years. As it expanded, the rulers came into contact with the Berbers, as we said, through their economic and social interactions. They got closer and closer to al-Islam, and they became Muslims on their own. The rulers became Muslims on their own, and as a result, they set a pattern for what would happen in the rest of Western Africa. So the next great empire from that evolution is the Empire of Mali. We have King Sundiata, who was the founding king of that particular civilization, that particular empire. Sundiata, after him, the rest of the rulers were all Muslims in that same tradition. Now more and more the ruling class are becoming closer to al-Islam because of these interactions of trade and of culture. And so the ruling class are now becoming Muslim, and as the ruling class become closer to al-Islam, the people are becoming closer to al-Islam as well. And so of those kings, those successive kings in the Mali Empire, one stands out. What's his name?
Mansa Musa.
Yes, Mansa Musa. And what is he famous for?
Riches.
Oh,
Yes. What else? Hajj. Exactly. 1324, 1325, Mansa Musa takes 60,000 people across the desert on Hajj. He had 15,000 camels. 15,000 camels. 8,000 soldiers. A total of 60,000 people across the desert. Loaded, those camels were loaded with gold, salt, and other commodities. He arrives in Egypt and gives away so much gold it breaks the gold market. It didn't recover for decades. He had passed out so much gold, it was like, this is your gift. And so it lost its value because it was so much, it outweighed the whole economic system. It brought the whole economic system out of balance. But on the way back from Hajj, he brings an architect from Egypt. And on the way back, he stops at Gao, which was one of the strongholds of Mali at the time. Redesigns the Mosque of Gao. And he travels between Gao and Timbuktu, and every stop along the way, he builds a new masjid. Every stop along the way between Gao and Timbuktu, he builds a new masjid. He is so devout that he encourages the followers to study al-Islam, to study the Quran, and become better Muslims. This is very important. Next and last empire of Western Africa, Sangye, founded by Sunni Ali Bear, and his successor, Askir Muhammad Torre, another beautiful, devout Muslim who actually expands the wealth by developing stronger trading relationships with the Muslims of Northern Africa, expands their wealth and uses that expanded wealth to invest in Timbuktu. What Mansa Musa had really prompted with the beginning of Timbuktu, he takes the wealth of the empire and builds out Timbuktu to become a preeminent learning institution for Western Africa, and known and famous for learning, scientific advancement, and achievement. Last but not least, Timbuktu. We can't leave our talk on Western Africa without talking about the University of Timbuktu. Became a center of Islamic scholarship for Africa for 500 years. Some of the top scholars in the Muslim world went there. You know what they consider wealth in Timbuktu?
library.
Yes, and books. Books. So you would consider wealth if you had a big library. If you had your own book. Alhamdulillah. Excellent. So, now let's talk about the African slave trade, because we're transitioning out of the beautiful picture of life and now looking at a dark chapter in human history that really brings us to today in a special way. So we want to look at this critical element of history and how people were uprooted from their homelands, brought to America, and losing their humanity and what that does to people. And so I've asked my wife and assistant to help me with this. So inshallah, can you read some of these slides, please? Okay, here. No? Here you go.
Okay, the African slave trade. The historic backdrop: at least 12.5 million Africans of enormous cultural diversity were deported to the Americas over a period of nearly 4 centuries. It was the largest forced transoceanic Africans had developed a certain immunity to some of the tropical. They were known to have experience and skills in metalwork, mining, and tropical agriculture. The first African captives to be taken directly across the Atlantic and sold into slavery were transported in 1532. Thereafter, a steady transatlantic trade in human cargo developed. From the 1630s, there was a rapid expansion of sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. Demand for slave labor increased from West Africa and reached epic proportions. There developed over the next 200 years the largest migration of forced transportation of captive people ever devised in human history. The greatest evil of the transatlantic trade in people was the extent of human suffering involved and the callous disregard for human life and dignity by those who dealt with slaves. When a person was captured in the interior and dispatched to the coast for sale, it marked the beginning of a short remaining life of appalling degradation and suffering. Captives were no longer treated as fellow human beings, but as property, domestic livestock, to be herded together, examined, and bartered over. Captives were chained together and marched to the coast, where they were locked up in wooden cages to await the arrival of the next European trading ship. They were stripped naked, examined minutely to see if they were strong and healthy. Once a deal had been struck between the African middleman and European slave merchants, the most terrible part of their voyage began, the Middle Passage. On board ship, they were chained together in rows and forced to lie on specially constructed decks, which were arranged like shelves with less than a yard of space between them. They were unable to sit up or move freely for weeks, suffering in their own excreta and urine and given only enough food and water to keep them alive. Those who died were simply thrown overboard. On average, between 15 to 30% could be expected to die from disease, maltreatment, or exhaustion during the 4 to 6 weeks of the transatlantic crossing. Ship captains allowed for this by packing in more people. In this way, enough could be expected to survive the crossing for sale in America to make a handsome profit for the merchant who financed the voyage.
What's wrong with this picture?
Muslims were still had slaves.
Muslims were part of the slave trade. The slave trade, I'm sorry. Thank you, that's what I need a reminder. Muslims actually participated in the slave trade as well. We just recounted some of the horror of the whole situation, right? And we talked about this idea of Fakku Rakaba, free the slave. The example of the prophet, freeing slaves, the early companions, freeing slaves. Yet, the pull, the custom, the trade, the money, the wealth was so attractive. Some of our brothers maintaining their connection with the slave trade. And as we get into to how that progressed, we're going to see some of the problems involved in it. And I say that because it's important to understand that both Muslims, Christians, Jews, Africans, Arabs, and Europeans were all involved in the slave trade. African chiefs raided their neighbors and sold them into slavery. Muslims acted as middlemen and sometimes participated in raids, but acted as middlemen between the chiefs and the European slave traders. And you know what happened with the European slave traders. European slave traders came, set up forts along the west coast of Africa. You see this picture? The lower half, you see some of the areas in which slaves were extracted from out of Africa along that west coast called the Gold Coast. The upper picture shows you Muslim empires. About 25% of the slaves are projected to come out of Muslim countries. 10% went to America, the rest went to the other. That's reality, and that's something we have to be mindful of as we understand the sensitivity going forward. In 1619, a ship arrived in Fort Comfort, Virginia, with 20 enslaved Africans, which began slavery in America, called the Legacy of 1619.
Enslaved people were not recognized as human beings, but as property that could be mortgaged, traded, bought, sold, used as collateral, given as a gift, and disposed of violently. The framers of the Constitution carefully constructed a document that preserved and protected slavery without ever using the word. The shameful paradox of enshrining chattel slavery in the Constitution of a nation founded on individual freedom led to a hardening of the racial caste system. This caste system would become the cornerstone of the social, political, and economic system in America and become the source of ongoing systemic inequality. The dominant caste lived under the illusion of an innate superiority over all other groups of humans. Their ancestors grew accustomed to the unearned deference from the subjugated group and came to expect it. The caste system was maintained through wanton racial terrorism, both before and after the institution of chattel slavery was abolished. During the height of racial terror, African Americans were not merely killed, but castrated, burned alive, and dismembered with their body parts displayed in storefronts. In response to demands for civil rights, they strung African Americans from trees, beat and dumped their bodies into muddy rivers, assassinated them in their front yards, firebombed them on buses, mauled them with dogs, and murdered their children inside a church. This violence was meant to terrify and control the victims.
So, I know my time is escaping, but I have to make this point. The great paradox of America was it was founded on an ideal. The Declaration of Independence says what? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. Of them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the founding ideas of America. When they wrote the Constitution, they wrote in slavery. They recognized slavery. African Americans weren't recognized as full human beings. Women weren't recognized. The native peoples were not recognized as human beings. So women, the slaves, the indigenous people were not human beings. That was the irony of what they were creating, A beautiful idea, but when they implemented it in order to keep the colonies together, they implemented, they called the original sin of slavery, as well as this ongoing caste system that had to be maintained because they had to justify why all men were not created equal. Because some were subhuman. And that thinking became a cultural reality in America that haunts us to this day. So, we have this idea of people adapting from their reality, coming out of their African societies, coming into a land in which they were robbed of their name, their language, their culture, their identity. They were systematically dehumanized, purposely. Yet, they found ways to find joy, to find happiness, to live, to survive, and to thrive, and to adapt to that new reality, even though there was an oppressive reality outside of them. Their spirit, their soul kept alive. That's important. So you can shut off the avenue of learning. It was illegal to teach a slave to read. They lost their names, their connection with their culture, their heritage, their people. They were cut off totally. They couldn't even tell you what they couldn't speak their own language. If they spoke their native language, they were punished. They were given new names, and you couldn't use your African name. You saw the movie Roots, right? What was Kunta Kinte's name? What was his name? What name was he given? Toby. Right. These scenes are from the movie Roots. Recreation of that experience. And we're going to talk about the importance of that later, how it ties into al-Islam and our Islamic experience. What's the connection between Roots and Muslims?
Kente was a Muslim.
Yes. Keep going. What's the other connection? What was the movie Roots about? Kunta Kinte, right? And his experience. But who wrote the book?
Alex Haley.
Yes. And what was Alex Haley's association with Muslims?
No, that's how they story.
He worked with Malcolm X to do his autobiography. And by working with Malcolm X to do his autobiography, he was so touched by Malcolm X's connection with this bigger conscience. Remember? Muslims were promoting this bigger idea of not just being slaves, but having this larger connection. It prompted him to seek out his own roots. And he found that he had Muslim ancestors himself. So he wrote a book about it. This is the profound impact of Islam on American society and American culture. So, when they had the opportunity, they fought for their country and freedom. After the Civil War, they actually, during a period of Reconstruction, these ex-slaves joined Congress for a period of time for the 12 years of Reconstruction until the black codes and this whole society kicked back in of the racial caste system, and they were shut out for the next 100 years after that. They also, as a part of their adapting, they sought every means possible to realize their human aspirations. So when opportunities came, they left the South and migrated north and westward for new opportunities for their families. Part of that migration took them to places like Tulsa. Actually, that's my father's family from Tulsa. My father's family is from Tulsa. And they were victims of what? What happened in Tulsa?
That's right.
The Tulsa, what? Race massacre, right? People, African Americans, when they left the South, they were so happy to have an opportunity to establish their life. They created these beautiful environments for themselves. Black Wall Street. Tulsa was known for Black Wall Street, a mecca for business and for the African American community. But throughout America, not only Tulsa, but Chicago, all throughout the country, there were race riots in which mobs of white people destroyed, burned down black communities. Burned down those communities in order to penalize them for their success. Tulsa was the most egregious example. 300 people got killed in that riot, that massacre. These are actual pictures of that time. These are actual pictures of 300 people killed. As they continue to adapt, they adapted culturally in every form they could, creating new standards of culture. They adapted by trying to, and from the earliest days, trying to fight. They had slave rebellions and riots, most of which failed. The Amistad rebellion did succeed, but the others failed, in which the slaves were punished and killed for their ability. However, other methods were more successful. They created the Underground Railroad, by which slaves would run away and find freedom. My great-grandfather on my mother's side came to Illinois by virtue of the Underground Railroad. And as a result, our family has been established in Illinois ever since. After the late 1800s, my grandfather was born in the 1870s. We had geniuses helping the problem solving, from Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Ida B. Wells, Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, Huey P. Newton, and Imam W.D. Muhammad. Geniuses of Dr. Carver and those brilliant women who, in Hidden Figures, were mathematical geniuses that helped with the space program. We have the revolutionary voices from David Walker through Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and others. Along the bottom row, you have the modern day geniuses that established newspapers and vehicles. Malcolm X in the middle, what's he famous for in terms of media? Yes, he created one of the largest black newspapers he created, called Muhammad Speaks. Cultural leaders, we won't have time to go for that. Movement leaders. And one of the earliest movements we have is what we call the Niagara movement, which is a movement that, what was the Niagara movement important for? It was a response to lynching. Lynching got so bad that between the end of slavery all the way to the mid-1900s, 4,000 to 5,000 African Americans were lynched. Wow. And so in the early 1900s, a movement started that evolved into the NAACP. 4 years later, they created the NAACP as a response to this horrific horror. You know, after 9/11, I traveled throughout Peoria. I spoke to about 12 churches, about a dozen churches invited me to speak. I went in the area conference from the hood, and I taught class at Bradley for 2 years on his introduction to Islam. And you know, I asked, a lot of the people were non-Muslims, right? And so I asked them, I said, because at that time they were asking about Islamic terrorism. I said, what's the oldest terrorism group in America?
Slave trade, Ku Klux Klan.
The Ku Klux Klan. But when I said that, nobody knew the answer. No one knew the answer. And when I said it, it's like their eyes lit up. And they had a paradigm shift. I said, what was the image, what was the iconography of the Ku Klux Klan? What do? They burn crosses. Right? So this paradigm shift was like they blew their minds. Because now they saw that terrorism wasn't just something that you could pin on somebody else, that we might have had something to do with it too. And then you could have a conversation now, because it's something that's an evil that can impact everybody, right? So, spirituality and religion is going to lead us to our where we're at now. Well, our people were given Christianity on the slave plantation. Some of them even started their own churches. Richard Allen with the African Methodist Episcopal AME Church. Can you read this for me?
I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land.
I said that because Frederick Douglass is one of the most profound leaders of the 19th century. He was an advisor to Lincoln, but yet he made an observation that challenged people's morality, challenged their religiosity, and he forced them to confront this evil they were perpetrating on his people and justifying it with their religion. We had early Muslims who fought and maintained their Islamic identity, from Kunta Kinte to Ayubas, Suleiman Diallo, to Jogan Solomon, to Yaro Mahmoud. All of these are early Muslim slaves that maintain, no matter what you're going to do, I'm going to maintain my Islamic identity. Very important. Then you had the early movements, and this is what's going to get us to, inshallah, our conclusion as we look at how Islam developed in America. We had the early Garvey movement, which was a black nationalist movement, but it was also a Pan-African movement in which he challenged African Americans' imagination to think of themselves as having power and agency and ability to do things on their own. If only they could come together. So the Garvey movement was a phenomenal movement that organized hundreds of thousands of African Americans throughout America and even in like 20 other countries until he was deported because he was called to be a troublemaker. So that movement lasted about 10 years until they caught up with him and accused him of mail fraud and deported him back to Jamaica. During the same time, we have what we call the Moorish Science Temple, started by Noble Drew Ali. What connection can you make with his thinking here? Moorish Science Temple.
Morocco.
The Berbers.
The Berbers, the Moors, and Island others, right? So here was another effort by early African Americans to make a connection outside of their slave experience back to the early Islamic experiences. Now, it was very crude and very insufficient. The Moorish Science Temple of America, they had these. Remember, during these early times, people had been raised in Christianity. So, but they were reaching out for Islam in some fashion, in some way. So they had this concept of love and truth and peace and freedom and justice because they perceived Islam as this alternative. They synthesized ideas from several religious and cultural traditions, creating their own kind of independent thinking, approaching Islam. It's important to understand that, they changed the names. And as we get into the movement, the transition to the Nation of Islam, this was very, very important. Why was this important? To change people's identity. What do you think?
Sense of pride.
Yeah, because the slave master had taken their names, right? He took their names and assigned to them names and identity that was subhuman. So these early efforts tried to reconnect with their humanity and have self-control in doing so. Unfortunately, they were kind of crude. Noble Drew Ali called himself a prophet of Islam. Why did he do that?
Because that's what people called their teachers here.
Yes, exactly. It was common in Christianity to call people a prophet. So they were coming out of a Christian concept. You see that same thing with Abu Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. They're coming out of a Christian mindset. So they're using Christian logic approaching Islam. Even, got them closer to the idea of the Quran, but he called it the Quran, a Circle 7, which he actually produced himself. So now, let's look at this foundation. The African American experience is on four, understanding Islam from four perspectives: the African American experience, the Garvey movement, the Moorish Science Temple, and the legacy of W.D. Farad. So, inshallah, we're going to make our conclusion at this point. So, Farad Muhammad came from outside of America. But he is called by scholars one of the most significant figures of American Islamic history, particularly from the African American community. What did he do? He took the language of Islam and created this masterful package. It It wasn't Islam, but he created a social movement with Islamic language that began to reverse the psychology of the slave, capture the African American identity and imagination, redefine the ethnic identity, produce a new cultural paradigm, and neutralize the psychology of white supremacy. That's powerful stuff. He used terms that were designed to reverse the logic. He called the black man a god. What was that designed to do? Remember, if you saw the movie Malcolm X, everything was black was called evil. Right? The black plague, black ball, black male, right? So in the language context, everything that was associated with black was evil. Everything associated with white was good. So he reversed the psychology and said, okay, I'm going to reverse it now. Because I'm reversing this idea of white supremacy. So he used it through a psychological ploy. Looked at new identity with new names, empowered self-determination. Hey, can you give me the, what you call it? Yeah, you're gonna plug in the charger. We're almost done. Is there, you have an extension? No, that's not it. Here it is, yeah. There's an extension cord. Shoe con. Here it is, right? I forgot to plug this up before we got started. Can you plug it up for me? Okay, so created a new culture of learning. Remember the learning culture of Al-Andalus and the Muslim civilizations of Western Africa? The slaves weren't allowed to read. So part of this new progression back toward Islam was saying that part of the Islamic experience is to love learning, to love knowledge. So he created a new culture of learning, which he mandated lessons as a part of their progression experience. Some of those lessons were called actual facts, in which believers had to learn the dimensions of the universe, of the speed of light, the circumference of the earth, the weight of the earth, 6 septillion tons. I remember that lesson. That proved to be true. So he took science and made it a mandatory part of their progression into Islam. So then you have Dr. Elijah Muhammad, whose wife heard the lessons first from Farad. She invited him, and he became one of Farad's strongest messengers and representatives. So he was responsible, particularly after Farad. Farad disappeared mysteriously between 1933 and 1934 after this teaching of this group of people about Islam for about 3 to 4 years. He left Elijah in charge as the supreme minister. When Elijah first met Farad, he said something very unique to him that became historic. He said, I know who you are. You're God in the flesh. And Farad said, don't tell nobody yet. Why did he say that?
Tell us.
Why? Why did he say that? Because from the Christian perspective, Jesus was a God. And Jesus was scheduled to return, right? They're thinking about Jesus. He's thinking this person is Jesus coming back in the flesh. So he's ascribing from his Christian thinking this connection between Jesus and this man, teaching them about Islam. That became his logic model going forward. So if Farad was the new Jesus, that made him his messenger. Now we know that's not Islam, but remember this wasn't Islam. This is not Islam. This was Islamic language and terms with Christian thinking. You know what the scripture was that Elijah Muhammad used? The Bible. He never taught from the Quran. He had a third grade education. He never taught from the Quran. So he used the Christian Bible to teach from, and used Islamic terms to capture their imagination to think they were Muslims. This hybrid ideology of biblical language and Christian thinking. This movement toward a social transformation, but importance of understanding the Islamic moral standards of social reform and economic self-sufficiency. There are 4 people right here on this picture. Can you recognize any of them? You see Malcolm in the top left? Right below that top left, in that middle section, who do you see? Malcolm on the left. Who do you see on the right? You see Louis X, who became Louis Farrakhan. Malcolm was his mentor. Who on the left-hand side, who you see next to Malcolm? W.D. Muhammad, who was the son of Elijah Muhammad. And on the right, who do you see? Muhammad Ali. All of them came out of the Nation of Islam. Let me say this. Remember the Garvey movement? In which he mobilized hundreds of thousands of people and created this kind of military structure to do that? The Nation of Islam created that same structure, a military structure. But they also created mosque training, newspapers, their own school system, in which they studied Arabic, the Quran, African American history, astronomy, and higher mathematics. In this school system, Elijah Muhammad brought Muslim scholars to teach the children. The K through 12 system was called the University of Islam. Now, this is what? Primary school and high school, called what? University, right? The University of Islam. Imam Muhammad, his son, learned Quran as a child. That's important to understand as we go forward. Created an empire of businesses in the 60s after Malcolm's tremendous leadership. From newspapers, from fish, to grocery stores, to ultimately a bank and restaurants. And let me say this as we close out. Upon his passing, his son assumed the leadership. You see the picture in the upper hand left corner? What do you see?
Farah Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad, and W.D. Muhammad.
They took that picture in the 50s. What feature pops out at you in that picture?
Progression.
Yes, what else?
Books.
Imam Muhammad is holding out the Quran. Farad is reading the Quran. And Imam Muhammad was holding out the Quran, right? He's got his hand on his father's shoulder, because he's a successor. His father taught from what?
The Bible.
The Bible. But his son was trained to read the Quran in grammar school, in the Arabic. And so when he came into office, he transitioned the Muslim community at that time. That was a hybrid community using Islam as a label, but with Christian thinking and logic and teaching into al-Islam. And so his progression is historic. How he was recognized as a world leader. Here's Yasser Arafat. He's meeting with other interfaith leaders. He brought the fullness and purity of Islamic life without the mythology, because remember, Farad brought what? Mythology. In order to kill white supremacy, he had to use mythology. Imam Muhammad, we got to get out of mythology. Now's the time for the deen of al-Islam. That's enough for us. He used the guidance of the Quran, the life example of our prophet, peace and blessing upon him, and deen and fitr, which is important. He observed and taught the concept of Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, the oneness of Allah's creation, the oneness of humanity. This is one of his quotes, right? We believe in one God, the unity of man and a family, right? The oneness of humanity, all of humanity. Traditions of human excellence, new Quranic language concepts. He introduced the community to a Quranic logic model based upon fitra-based natural thinking. He emphasized, just like the Prophet did in transforming through the city of Medina, that Muslim community, that a total transformation in business, in government, education, and culture. He emphasized those same principles in transforming our Muslim life. He had the inclusive concept of Islamic democracy and guided by the idea of the Quranic concept of Imam Bashir Ali. And then understand and promoting the American ideal. Okay, we're America, we want to hold you to your ideals. You said all men are created equal, we're going to hold you to that. And we're going to participate in the government where the Nation of Islam said, no, we're not fooling with the government. He said, no, we want civic engagement, but we want to hold America to its ideals. Here he's meeting the Pope, and he's also meeting Yasser Arafat, promoted throughout the world, actually recognized throughout the world, and through many Muslim leaders as one of our preeminent scholars. And his greatest contribution was his tafsir of Quran. I invite you to try to study Imam Muhammad and some of his phenomenal tafsir of the Quran. So as we close out, that's where we're at now. We have our local masjids and Islamic centers, about a network of about 150 masjids from his legacy. He transformed from temples to masjids. Alhamdulillah. This masjid was one of the first masjids built from the ground up as a masjid in 1980 in Cleveland, Masjid Bilal. We have now our shura bodies. He was the middle shura body. We have our national shura bodies of imams and other community leaders. We have webinars, we have community development and leadership webinars on a regular basis. We have our Islamic leadership training program where we work with young Muslim leaders from across the country and develop their Islamic talent and skills, both men and women. So we're training leaders for the future to operate in all these areas of Islamic life. We have the legacy of Sister Claire Muhammad, who held together the Muslim school system after her passing of when her husband was sent to jail. Imam Muhammad was 40-something years old and when World War II broke out, but they accused him of draft dodging and put him in jail for 5 years until war was over. And during that time, Claire Muhammad held the Muslim school system together, and so the school system is now named after her, the Claire Muhammad school system throughout the country. We have these Muslim organizations and institutions that reflect the fullness of Islamic life in America. And so, inshallah, assalamu alaikum, that's our presentation.
Takbir.
Takbir.
Takbir. If anybody has any questions for Imam Bashir, we'd be really excited and happy to take questions. But before that, I just want to thank you and Sister Aisha, Imam Bashir, for this very in-depth presentation. SubhanAllah, it's definitely an awakening to the history of the unknown to many of us. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the ability to learn lessons from the past, right? And not repeat the inhumanity that went on, even from certain Muslim circles. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take us from strength to strength as an ummah. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the ability to bridge build and to build bridges and bring about rectification at a personal as well as a societal level, bi'idhnillah. So with this, I'm going to take a few questions for Sheikh Osama.
Jazakumullah khair. So, my question, honestly speaking, Brother Bashir,
Yes.
is, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I feel like the real impact on the lives of African Americans and Muslims in America has two main figures, but we're not celebrating anything about it. Hajj Malik Shabazz, alayhi rahmatullah, and Muhammad Ali. in terms of their impact on the African Americans in general, as well as the Muslims in the United States. Those two figures have tremendous impact. Yet we are being taught, even anyone right now, we're being taught, you just need to be very peaceful in order for you to get your rights. And Hajj Malik Shabazz, and as more as I read about him, as more as I know about him, I come to appreciate that great man, may Allah have mercy over him, is if you don't make noise, you're not going to get your rights. So what is it that, what's the message that you feel? Do you feel the same thing that I feel? Or do you have something different?
Well, that was very perceptive. You know what they had in common? They challenged the thinking process in a way that made America more uncomfortable than Dr. King did. Dr. King was a Christian, right? And he challenged them through their Christian thinking. They were Muslims. And they approached it differently. They were approached it from a bigger perspective and, like, as you said, profound. Now, actually, Malcolm has been embraced through the movement in the African American community. Malcolm is well respected and loved, right? Muhammad Ali was embraced by America ultimately in the Olympics in the 90s. When he held the torch, America cried. Because after America hates you for a while, then it'll love you. So sometimes the time has to go by because Muhammad Ali, he showed his universal love of humanity that captured their imagination and ultimately captured their heart. Guess what? When you go to Louisville, there's a Muhammad Ali Center, which is a big part of Louisville. So Muhammad Ali is in the hearts of America in a different way. Malcolm is in the hearts of the African American community, universal. So yes, they are beloved figures, Muhammad Ali more than Malcolm.
But I don't see that they are being, like, the fairness that is supposed to be given to them, the justice, they're not given due justice.
Well, you're perceptive because, you know, they struggle with Islam.
Yes.
America struggles with Islam. They have a Christian nationalist movement now, right? You know what that is, right? Saying that America is a Christian country and everybody else shouldn't be here. So that's a strong movement that's evolving with a political, that's in one of the parties is promoting that right now. So yeah, they're struggling with diversity. America is struggling with it, and as they do, some of them are pushing back real hard in a very adversarial way. So
it's definitely saddening that the leaders who genuinely presented Islam and the morals of humanity to this society, they're not recognized. But this is very unfortunate, and as you know, we've been mentioning again and again, Sheikh Osama has been echoing this message as well. But you know, until we don't involve ourselves in society, until we don't speak up for the truth, until we don't defend our rights, it'll just be a dull game, you know. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, every time I think of Al-Hajj Malcolm X, I tear because of the, you know, the sacrifices that he went through for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in those lines, Imam Warith Muhammad, you know, he had to take a lot of heat for sort of, you know, leaving the nation and bringing about genuinity in faith. And among the products of his efforts is Imam Siraj wa Hajj. You know, Siraj wa Hajj, he speaks at some of our conferences. He was a product of the guidance of Imam Warith Muhammad, rahimahullah. So I really wish your aspirations come to life, Sheikh Osama, and I wish Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honors these people in this world before the hereafter. Bidnillahi ta'ala. Any other? Excuse me. Any?
I just want to, inshallah, share a little bit more insight about Osama's question. The very short and simple answer is because most of America still simply is not ready or willing to learn the truth about Malcolm X or what he taught and his difference. And even with Dr. Martin Luther King himself, most of what we learn in America is still just that one short "I have a dream" quote, and we still are not